So, another Tuesday dawned, and honestly, it felt like any other Tuesday. You know the drill. Alarm goes off usually way too early for my liking, but the cows don't care about my sleep schedule. There's a certain bovine rhythm to life out here, and you either get with it or you're constantly fighting against the current. I choose to get with it. Coffee in hand, a proper mug, none of those fancy, half-empty paper cups. I'm out the door before the sun even thinks about really cresting the horizon. First order of business, checking on the livestock, making sure everyone's accounted for and healthy. A quick survey of the fences, a mental note of anything that needs fixing. It's a rhythm I've fallen into over the years, a comfortable routine that's usually pretty uneventful. And that's exactly how I like it. My place, as you probably know by now, isn't just a house. It's a working farm, a decent-sized chunk of land, not enormous, but enough to keep me busy and provide for myself. A few acres of pasture, a couple of barns that always seem to need some sort of repair, and of course the ponds. The ponds. Those are my pride and joy. More than just watering holes for the livestock, they're a little ecosystem I've carefully cultivated. A source of peace, for sure, but also where I keep a decent stock of bass and catfish. Been doing it for years, ever since I inherited the place from my granddad. It started as a little hobby, a way to relax, and slowly grew into something more substantial, a sustainable part of my farm operations. This particular Tuesday, though, had a specific task on the agenda. I'd spent the last month or so digging out and lining a new, larger pond down by the south pasture. It was finally ready. The water level was good, the ecosystem was settling in nicely, and honestly, it was looking fantastic. I had a real sense of accomplishment seeing it filled, fed by the natural spring that runs through my land, completely self-sufficient. Time to move some of the younger fish from the older, more crowded pond. Just a typical farm chore, really. Nothing dramatic. No high-stakes corporate mergers, no nail-biting deadlines. Just good, honest work under a bright, clear sky. Perfect day for moving fish, I remember thinking. I even remember thinking how perfect the weather was for it. Not too hot, not too cold. Just that sweet spot where you can work up a good sweat without feeling like you're melting into the soil. I'd already spent the better part of the morning patching up a fence where a mischievous badger had decided to dig, then wrestled with a stubborn water pump that chose today to act up. You know, the usual farm stuff that keeps you humble and constantly reminded that nature bats last. Lunch was a quick sandwich, turkey and Swiss, eaten leaning against my tractor, watching the chickens peck around the yard, oblivious to my struggles. Pretty idyllic, all things considered, despite the minor irritations. After lunch, with the sun a bit higher but still pleasantly warm, I geared up for the fish transfer. Grabbed my trusty waders, the ones with the perpetually damp spot from that one time I underestimated a puddle, a couple of those big, aerated tubs I used for transport, and started making my way towards the main pond. The plan was simple, straightforward, like most things on a farm. Net the smaller fish, gently transfer them to the tubs with fresh, aerated water from the pond itself, then drive them down to the new pond, just a short trek across the property. Rinse and repeat a few times, making sure not to stress the fish too much. It's a bit of a process, takes a good few hours, but it's incredibly satisfying work. Seeing those little guys dart into their new, spacious home, knowing they'll have more room to grow, to thrive, that's what makes it all worthwhile. It's about providing a good life for everything under my care. I even remember humming some ridiculously cheesy country song to myself as I walked, probably something about trucks or beer or both, completely out of tune, I'm sure, just enjoying the quiet. The only sounds were the gentle rustle of the leaves, the distant bleating of a sheep, the faint hum of insects going about their business. There wasn't a single cloud in the sky, and the afternoon sun was hitting just right, making everything feel golden, peaceful. A perfect, utterly unremarkable afternoon. A snapshot of everyday farm life. Or so I thought, because that's the thing about normal days, isn't it? Sometimes they're just setting the stage for something completely, utterly absurd to come barreling in like a runaway tractor with a mind of its own. Little did I know, my peaceful Tuesday was about to take a sharp, unexpected turn, all thanks to someone who thought they knew my land better than I did. It was a Saturday morning, one of those rare, Perfect days in early spring, where the air was crisp but the sun felt warm on your skin. I was out by the old culvert, the one that ran directly from the natural spring on the HOA's common land and emptied into my much larger, privately owned reservoir system. This was the big day. I was finally relocating a batch of specially bred koi and some native bass fingerlings from my temporary holding tanks to their new, permanent homes. I had my waders on, a couple of aerated buckets by my side, and I was carefully guiding a net full of iridescent orange and white beauties into the first section of the reservoir, just where the natural spring water mixed in. It was tranquil, it was peaceful, and I was humming a little tune to myself, completely lost in the moment. Then, out of nowhere, a sound ripped through the quiet like a banshee discovering an unexpected bill. "What are you doing?" My hand slipped, and a few little bass fingerlings splashed back into the bucket. I nearly jumped out of my waders. I twisted around, heart thumping against my ribs like a hummingbird, and there she stood. Of course, it had to be her, Mrs. Henderson, or as she was known in my head, HOA Karen Prime Model. She was perfectly coiffed, her blonde bob a helmet of hairspray, wearing what I could only describe as an aggressively pastel pink athleisure set that probably cost more than my first car. Her face, already perpetually set in a disapproving pout, was now contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated outrage, her eyes wide with what she clearly believed was justified horror. I took a breath, trying to regain my composure. "Good morning, Mrs. Henderson," I said, forcing a polite nod. My internal monologue, however, was already screaming, "Oh, for Pete's sake, what now? I'm literally moving fish. Fish." She ignored my greeting entirely, her voice rising in pitch with each word. "Good morning? Good morning. You think this is a good morning when you are actively poisoning our water supply? What is that? Are those mutant goldfish? What kind of disease-ridden creatures are you dumping into our pristine ecosystem?" She took a step closer, pointing a perfectly manicured finger, trembling with indignation, directly at one of my aerated buckets. I just blinked at her. Poisoning? Disease-ridden? Pristine ecosystem? The spring water flowed directly from her pristine ecosystem and into my farm, where I used it for irrigation, livestock, and, yes, my aquaculture projects. Her pristine ecosystem was, in fact, just a small, decorative pond on the common land that sometimes overflowed into this natural culvert. "Mrs. Henderson," I began, trying to keep my tone even. "I'm not poisoning anything. These are koi and native bass. They're perfectly healthy, and I'm relocating them to my personal reservoir down on my farm. The water here is just part of the natural flow into my property." Her mouth opened and closed a few times, like a confused fish herself. Your personal reservoir? What are you talking about? This is HOA property. That water comes directly from the spring that we maintain. You can't just go around dumping whatever you want into it. This affects everyone. What about our property values? My rose garden? The children who might swim in this water. She gestured wildly around, though there wasn't a child or a rose garden within sight of the muddy bank I was standing on. The only thing affected was her sense of misplaced authority. I felt a vein start to throb in my temple. The annoyance was quickly overriding the initial surprise. "Mrs. Henderson, with all due respect, I am not dumping whatever I want. I'm carefully introducing fish into a controlled environment that is part of my farm. And this water, while it originates on HOA land, flows directly onto my property and becomes my water supply from that point on. I have a permit for these fish, and for the water usage, for that matter." I emphasized my water supply in the hope that it might penetrate her bubble of self-importance. She practically vibrated with indignation. "Permit? Water supply? Don't you dare try to bamboozle me with your farmer talk. This is our water, the HOA's water, and you are ruining it. I don't know what kind of grotesque fish you're trying to breed, but it's an abomination. I'm calling the police. I'm calling the HOA president. You are going to be fined into oblivion, young man. You just wait." She pulled out a gleaming smartphone, her fingers already jabbing at the screen with furious urgency. Her eyes narrowed in a triumphant, vindictive glare. I just stood there, ankle deep in the cool water, a net full of very confused fish still in my hand, watching her furiously dial. My bewilderment was slowly giving way to a weary, cynical smile. "Oh, Karen, I thought you're stepping into." So, I'm out there. Sun's beating down. Just finished hauling the last bucket of feeder fish to the new pond on my property. It's a good day, you know? Productive. Got a sweat going. Feeling good about expanding my little aquaculture operation. I wipe my brow, take a swig of water, and then I hear it. This throat-clearing noise, this imperious ahem, that could only belong to one person in this entire development. Karen. She's standing by the edge of her perfectly manicured lawn, arms crossed over a brightly patterned blouse that probably cost more than my first car, sunglasses perched on her nose like she's about to dissect a frog. Her expression, pure, unadulterated disdain. "What exactly do you think you're doing, young man?" she barks, her voice a little too loud for the peaceful afternoon. I turn around slowly, trying to keep my face neutral. I've lived here long enough to know that engaging Karen directly, especially when she's in full HOA enforcer mode, is like trying to reason with a particularly aggressive wasp. You just gotta let them buzz, spray some Raid, and move on. Except, in this case, the Raid was my patience, and it was running low. "Morning, Karen," I say, trying for pleasant. "Just moving some fish to my pond. Gotta get 'em settled before it gets too hot." She narrows her eyes, pushing her sunglasses up her nose even further. "Fish? These fish? From that creek?" She gestures dramatically towards the stream that bordered my property. The same stream that eventually fed into the community's decorative pond. "Do you have any idea of the ecological implications of introducing foreign species into our delicate ecosystem? Not to mention the potential for disease." I just stared at her. Foreign species? These were native minnows and some small base from a licensed supplier. All perfectly safe. I'd even done my research. "Karen, with all due respect, these aren't foreign. They're common to the region, and I have permits for everything." I didn't actually have permits for moving minnows within my own property fed by a natural spring, but I figured it sounded official enough to shut her down. Didn't. Her nostrils flared. "Permits? From whom? The trout whisperer? This is an HOA community, not some backwoods swamp. We have rules. You can't just go around dumping whatever you please into the water supply." "Water supply?" My eyes twitched. My water supply, technically, but I wasn't about to get into that with her. "Not yet. It's my private pond, Karen. And this isn't exactly a public reservoir. It's a natural stream that flows through my property." "Oh, I'll say it flows. Straight into our community pond, which we pay to maintain. Do you think we want your pond scum infecting our perfectly clean water feature? This is a clear violation of the HOA covenants." She pulled out her phone, her fingers already flying across the screen. "I'm calling Mr. Henderson. The entire board needs to be aware of this blatant disregard for our property values." My frustration was starting to boil. "Karen, calm down. There's no violation. I'm not doing anything wrong." "We'll see about that," she chirped, a self-satisfied smirk playing on her lips. She walked away, phone pressed to her ear, presumably already spinning her tale of ecological disaster to poor Mr. Henderson. A few days later, the email arrived. A sternly worded notice from the HOA board, citing unauthorized alteration of common area water features and potential environmental hazard. It demanded I cease and desist moving fish and attend an emergency board meeting. An emergency board meeting. For fish. I swear, the drama these people could conjure out of thin air was astounding. I walked into that meeting, expecting a reasonable discussion. What I got was a Spanish Inquisition, led by Karen, who was practically radiating self-righteousness. She'd brought printouts from Wikipedia about invasive species, highlighted in obnoxious yellow. She even had a photo she'd clearly taken of me, mid-fish transfer, looking like I was performing some arcane ritual. Mr. Peterson, Mr. Henderson, the board president, began, sounding weary. "We've received a rather passionate complaint regarding your activities near the community stream." "Passionate is one word for it," I muttered under my breath. Karen immediately interjected. It's not passion, Mr. Henderson, it's concern. Concern for our property values. Concern for our shared resources. He's introducing unknown biological elements into our community's water. Who knows what diseases these things could be carrying? She looked at me with an expression that suggested I was single-handedly unleashing the plague upon the HOA. I took a deep breath. Look, Mr. Henderson, members of the board, these aren't unknown biological elements. They're minnows and small bass, species native to this region. I purchased them from a reputable local supplier. My farm, which this stream flows through, has always utilized this water. I'm simply stocking a new pond. But it connects to our pond, Karen wailed, clapping her hands together dramatically. It's a direct conduit for his filth. Karen, please, Mr. Henderson said, pinching the bridge of his nose. Mr. Peterson, while we appreciate your explanation, the covenants clearly state that alterations to common areas or activities that could impact shared resources require prior board approval. You didn't seek that. But this isn't a common area where it passes through my land, I argued, my voice rising. It's on my private property. I'm not altering the flow. I'm not diverting it. I'm just adding some fish that were already in the ecosystem anyway, just not in my particular stretch. But the risk, Mr. Peterson, Karen shrieked, clearly enjoying being the center of attention. What if he's farming some kind of mutant carp? What if they eat all the other fish? What if they carry some kind of supervirus? What if they contaminate our drinking water? My head started to throb. Drinking water? The community pond wasn't a drinking water source. This was pure, unadulterated hysteria. Karen, that's absurd. This is a pond, not a CDC lab. The board members looked uncomfortable. They clearly didn't understand the specifics, but Karen's fear-mongering was effective. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat again. Regardless, Mr. Peterson, the board has voted. We require you to remove the fish from your pond immediately and cease any further stocking activities until a full environmental impact study can be conducted. Failure to comply will result in fines. Fines? For fish? I felt a surge of pure, indignant rage. They were just buying into Karen's nonsense hook, line, and sinker. I looked at Karen, who was beaming, practically preening. She thought she'd won. She thought she'd successfully bullied me into submission. Cold, hard resolve settled over me. I understand, I said, my voice dangerously calm. So, you're demanding I remove the fish, conduct an environmental study, and cease all activities related to my farm's water usage. That is correct, Mr. Henderson confirmed, looking relieved that I seemed to be capitulating. And if I don't? I asked, looking directly at Karen. Then we will have no choice but to escalate, she said, her smile widening into a triumphant sneer. Further fines, legal action, and perhaps a call to the authorities. A call to the authorities. For fish, that was it. She'd actually said it. The line had been crossed. My blood ran cold, then hot. This wasn't about fish anymore. This was about her trying to control what I did on my own land, about her petty tyranny. Well, I said, pushing back my chair, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across my face, the kind of smile you make when you know something nobody else does, and you're about to drop a bomb. If you want to escalate, Karen, then let's escalate. I stood up, walked out of that meeting, leaving them all sitting there, probably wondering what had just happened. I could almost hear Karen already celebrating her victory. Little did she know, she just handed me the shovel to dig her own very deep, very embarrassing hole. And sure enough, a few days later, the flashing lights of a sheriff's cruiser were pulling up my driveway. Karen, of course, was standing at the edge of her property again, phone out, filming, looking like the cat that got the cream. Oh, she'd called the cops all right. She had no idea what she'd just set in motion. So there I was, knee-deep in pond water, wrestling a net full of feeder fish, the ones I'd bought for my new aquaponics system, when I heard it. The unmistakable wail of a police siren, getting closer, then abruptly cutting off right at the edge of my property. My heart sank, but honestly, part of me almost laughed. I knew exactly who had called them. I straightened up, wiping a muddy hand across my forehead. And there she was, Karen, striding across the lawn, face already a furious shade of puce, flanked by two bewildered-looking sheriff's deputies. She pointed a trembling finger, not at me, but at the little blue plastic tubs I was using to transport the fish. "Officer, there he is, polluting the neighborhood, stealing our water, moving invasive species into his illegal farm." Her voice was a shrill, piercing shriek that made my ears ring. One of the deputies, a younger guy with a patient but weary expression, held up a hand. "Ma'am, could you please calm down? We just need to understand what's happening here." He then turned to me. "Sir, we received a report of unauthorized activity, potential water theft, and environmental disturbance." I sighed, pinching the bridge of my nose. "Unauthorized activity? Officer, I'm just moving fish from my old pond to the new system on my farm." I gestured vaguely towards the acres behind my house. "These are perfectly legal, non-invasive species, mostly carp and tilapia, for my aquaponics. And water theft? I'm drawing water from my own well, on my own land." Karen, however, wasn't having any of it. "He's lying. He's been diverting the creek water, our creek water. It's on the HOA property. He's practically draining us dry for his filthy fish farm." She was practically bouncing with indignation now, her hands clenching and unclenching at her sides. I noticed a few neighbors had started to gather, drawn by the sirens and Karen's escalating volume, some subtly pulling out their phones. Oh, this was going to be good for the gram, I just knew it. The older deputy, a grizzled veteran, eyed the small creek that trickled lazily past the edge of my property and then back to Karen. "Ma'am, is this the creek you're referring to? It looks pretty much at its normal level." "It's not about the level now," Karen shrieked, totally ignoring him. "It's about the principle. He's disrupting our ecosystem. He's a menace to our property values. We moved here for the pristine environment, the tranquility, not for some redneck with a fish farm." She practically spat the last words, her gaze burning into me with pure, unadulterated contempt. I felt a slow, dangerous simmer start in my chest. Redneck, huh? This woman had been a thorn in my side since the day I bought this place, constantly complaining about my fence, my garden, the way my dog looked at her cat. But this, calling the police over me moving fish on my own land, and then insulting me in front of everyone, this was a whole new level of audacity. "Ma'am, with all due respect," the younger deputy began, trying to de-escalate, but Karen cut him off. "He has no respect for anyone. He thinks he can just do whatever he wants because he bought that dilapidated old farm. Well, guess what, mister? You're still part of this community and we have rules. Rules about water usage, about what you can and cannot do near our shared resources." She pointed dramatically at the creek again, then at me. "He is stealing our water, our precious, life-giving water that feeds our beautiful ponds and our community irrigation. And he's doing it for fish." Her voice reached a fever pitch, cracking on the last word. That was it. My patience evaporated. A wicked grin slowly spread across my face, and I could feel the tension radiating off the gathered onlookers. This was the moment. I took a deep breath, fixing my gaze directly on Karen, ignoring the deputies for a second. "Karen?" I said, my voice calm, almost dangerously so, cutting through her tirade. "Let me ask you something." She faltered, momentarily taken aback by my sudden calm. "What? What now? You going to deny it?" "No," I said, shaking my head. "I'm going to clarify something for you. You keep talking about our water. You keep talking about the HOA property and shared resources in reference to this creek." I paused for dramatic effect, letting my eyes sweep over the two deputies, then the gathered neighbors whose phone cameras were all pointed directly at us now. "Do you know who owns the water rights to this creek? To the entire water supply that feeds this HOA community?" Karen scoffed, regaining her bluster. "The HOA, obviously. We all contribute to its upkeep." I slowly, deliberately, reached into my back pocket, pulling out a folded document. It wasn't the actual deed, but a notarized copy of the easement agreement and water rights. I unfurled it with a snap, holding it up just enough for everyone to see the official-looking seals. "No, Karen," I said, my voice rising slightly, now carrying across the quiet crowd. "The HOA doesn't own it. I do." A stunned silence fell. Even the deputies looked surprised. Karen's mouth, which had been open to retort, simply hung agape. Her eyes, wide with disbelief, flickered between the document and my face. "This property," I continued, gesturing around my farm, "came with the historical water rights. Every single drop of water that flows through that creek, that fills your ornamental ponds, that irrigates your precious HOA landscaping originates or passes through my land first, and the rights to it are legally, unequivocally mine. The HOA has an easement, a lease agreement with the previous owner which, upon my purchase, transferred directly to me, for the grand sum of, wait for it, $1 a year. And that dollar, Karen, is symbolic because it was agreed upon decades ago to ensure the water would continue to flow, but the ownership of the supply, the source, and the rights, that's all me." The younger deputy stepped forward, his eyes scanning the document. "Is this legit, sir?" "Absolutely," I replied, my gaze never leaving Karen's now ashen face. "Recorded at the county. Checked by my lawyers multiple times before I finalized the purchase. Your HOA bylaws even reference it, if you bother to read past the no gnomes clause." Karen's face went through a rapid series of transformations. Shock, denial, then pure, incandescent rage. "No, that's a lie. You're lying. That's impossible. We pay for the water. We pay our HOA fees for that." She started to stomp her foot, a desperate, childish gesture. "You pay HOA fees for the maintenance and distribution systems, Karen." I corrected her, a triumphant smirk now firmly on my face. "Not for the water itself. You're essentially leasing the right to use water that I own. And guess what? If you don't like how I'm using my water on my land for my fish, I could, theoretically, renegotiate that lease. Or even worse, terminate it." And that was it. The final straw. Karen's eyes bulged. A strangled gasp escaped her throat. She looked around at the silent, gawking neighbors, then back at me, then at the deputies who were now exchanging glances that clearly said, "Well, this is awkward." Her face crumpled, her mouth opened, but no coherent words came out, just a series of high-pitched, guttural squawks. Then, she let out a piercing, utterly unhinged scream, a sound that echoed across the quiet afternoon. You can't. This is an outrage. You're ruining everything. This is my community. You monster. You can't take our water. You just can't." She started flailing her arms, slapping the air, her voice escalating into an incoherent, tearful wail. The older deputy immediately stepped between us, putting a hand on her arm. "Ma'am, that's enough. You need to calm down." But Karen was beyond calming. She twisted away from him, stumbling backward a few steps, her eyes wild. Her perfectly coiffed hair was starting to come undone, strands flying around her contorted face. She was shrieking, a full-blown public meltdown, blaming me for everything, for the destruction of her perfect little world, for daring to expose her ignorance in front of the entire neighborhood. Neighbors were not only recording but visibly recoiling, some shaking their heads in utter embarrassment for her. I just stood there, arms crossed, watching the spectacle. The sun glinted off the scales of the fish in my tubs. The deputies were trying to physically guide us screaming, thrashing Karen back towards her car, clearly wanting to get her off my property before she self-destructed completely. And all I could think was, finally. She called the cops on me for moving fish. She didn't know she was picking a fight with the literal source of her entire neighborhood's water. The satisfaction was almost as sweet as the fresh fish I'd be eating from my farm. Karen's voice was like nails on a chalkboard, echoing across my property. "He's clearly violating multiple HOA covenants, moving our fish, tampering with the common water source. It's just unacceptable. He needs to be cited, at the very least, for disturbing the peace and potentially ecological damage." I just stood there, arms crossed, trying to keep a straight face. The two officers, bless their hearts, looked utterly bewildered. One was taking notes, the other just kept glancing from Karen, red-faced and practically vibrating with self-importance. To me, standing calmly next to my fish tanks, you could practically hear the thoughts running through their heads. Is this really what we got called out for on a Tuesday afternoon? Ma'am, Officer Miller, the younger one, said with a sigh you could hear from space. He's on his own property, and the fish, they're in tanks, not exactly in the community pond at this moment. But they came from the community pond, and that water, that pond, that supply, it belongs to the homeowners. It's our water, she shrieked, pointing a finger at me that was trembling with indignation, as if I was personally draining the reservoir for a hot tub party. This was my moment, the exact moment I had been savoring, ever since her first ridiculous phone call to the HOA, threatening to send lawyers my way. I took a deep breath, letting a slow, deliberate smile form on my lips. Actually, Karen, I said, my voice low and steady, cutting through her increasingly frantic babbling. You're absolutely right about one thing. She paused, narrowing her eyes, clearly expecting me to concede some minor point. Oh, and what, pray tell, would that be, Mr. Henderson? It is your water, I continued, making sure my eyes met hers, letting her marinate in that half-truth for a second. The water for the entire HOA, the community pond, the irrigation system, everything. It absolutely belongs to you. You're paying for it. She puffed out her chest, a smug, triumphant look spreading across her face like mold on old bread. Exactly, which is precisely why you have no right to tamper with it. You cannot just take things that belong to the community. And you're paying for it, I reiterated, my voice dropping just a fraction, because it's supplied by the well system on my property. The well system that I own. The one that was established long before the HOA even existed, and which I have a standing, ironclad contract with the HOA to provide water from. A contract, I might add, that specifies I have full, undisputed rights to manage the source, including the flora and fauna within it, so long as the agreed-upon water quality standards are met for the community. The silence that followed was so profound, you could have heard a goldfish blink. Karen's jaw went slack, her eyes widening like saucers. The officers, who had been leaning against their patrol car, straightened up in unison, exchanging a quick, wide-eyed glance that screamed, "Well, this just got interesting." You could practically see the gears grinding in their heads as they reevaluated the entire situation. Karen spluttered, her face draining of all color, then flushing a deep, angry, almost purple red. That's preposterous. I've been on the board for 12 years. I would know if some farmer owned our water supply. This is some lie you've concocted to avoid consequences. Well, Karen, I replied, leaning back slightly, crossing my arms, genuinely enjoying the spectacular implosion unfolding before me. Perhaps you should have read the founding documents a little more closely, or maybe those thick binder copies of the original land deeds and utility agreements. It's all in there, clear as day. And officer, I turned to the younger cop, a polite but firm tone in my voice. I'd be more than happy to provide you copies of the relevant sections of the contract and deed, if you'd like to confirm everything I've said. Officer Miller cleared his throat, looking distinctly uncomfortable now, but clearly understanding the gravity of the situation. Mr. Henderson, that won't be necessary. It sounds like this is a civil matter, if anything, and definitely not something for us. This is well outside our jurisdiction. The other officer, the seasoned veteran, piped up, shaking his head slightly at Karen. Yeah, ma'am, if what he's saying is true, and it sounds like he has the documentation to back it up, then he's well within his rights on his own property. We can't intervene in a contractual dispute, especially when no laws are being broken. He then shot Karen a look that clearly said, "You seriously wasted our time with this nonsense." The message was loud and clear. Karen, you done messed up. Karen stood there, absolutely speechless, her carefully constructed tower of outrage crumbling into a pile of ridiculous dust at her feet. The sheer, unadulterated vindication I felt in that moment was better than any expensive steak dinner. Her face, which had been so contorted with righteous fury just minutes before, now just looked deflated, humiliated. All that bluster, all that self-importance, evaporated in an instant. "Now, if you'll excuse me," I said, turning back to my fish tanks, a pleasant, almost cheerful tone in my voice. "I've got some very important fish to move to their new, larger home. And perhaps, Karen, you might want to consider familiarizing yourself with the actual details of the community you purport to govern before you go calling the police on your own water supplier. Have a good day." I picked up a net, gave her one final, pointed look, and then dipped it into the tank with a gentle splash. The officers, sensing the immediate de-escalation and the absolute defeat etched on Karen's face, quickly made their excuses and beat a hasty retreat, leaving her standing alone in the middle of my driveway. She looked like a forgotten lawn gnome in an ugly floral blouse, utterly bewildered and abandoned. It was glorious, the quiet satisfaction of seeing her face fall, realizing she had zero leverage, zero authority, was a feeling I'll savor for a very, very long time. It wasn't just about the fish or the water. It was about this woman constantly trying to exert control where she had no business. About her believing her entitlement trumped facts, logic, and legally binding documents. Later that week, I got an email from the actual HOA president, not Karen, thankfully. It was a rather sheepish apology, confirming everything I'd said, and thanking me for my continued vital service to the community. They even offered to compensate me for the new, high-efficiency aeration system I was installing in the pond, just as a gesture of goodwill. Suddenly, my relationship with the HOA was remarkably polite and appreciative. As for Karen, she disappeared from the board shortly after. I heard whispers she tried to rally support, claiming I was intimidating and abusing my position. But it backfired spectacularly. Everyone knew the truth now. She'd overplayed her hand, believing her authority was absolute, and the huge splash she thought she was making turned out to be her own spectacular undoing. And honestly, my fish have never been happier in their spacious new home, and I've definitely got a new level of peace of mind. Some lessons just have to be learned the hard way, especially when you're dealing with someone who thinks they run the world and everyone in it. So after all that, the dust settled. And man, did it settle with a dramatic, face-planting thud. I swear, the silence that followed the police officer's final, bewildered nod to Karen, then his utterly apologetic glance my way, was almost as deafening as her initial, ear-splitting screeching. He just kind of mumbled something about civil matter and private property, which, in this particularly absurd case, meant my private property, my water, and my very confused fish enjoying their new digs. Then, he practically sprinted back to his cruiser and beat a hasty retreat. Can't say I blamed him. Being caught in the crossfire of an HOA meltdown and a farmer's perfectly legal fish relocation is probably not what they train for at the academy. Nor is it how anyone wants to spend a Tuesday afternoon. Karen, bless her cotton socks, didn't just shrivel up and disappear like I half hoped she might. Oh no, she stood there, frozen solid, for a good minute, her jaw practically on the ground. Then, her face started to cycle through about 5 different shades of crimson, settling somewhere between boiled lobster and volcanic eruption imminent. She sputtered. She stammered, her hands flailing like she was trying to flag down a passing UFO. She even tried to argue with the retreating police car, waving her arms and yelling something about gross negligence and unsanitary conditions, as if they were somehow still on her side of this ridiculous aquatic dispute. It was pathetic, honestly, and kind of beautiful in a deeply satisfying schadenfreude sort of way. I just stood there, arms crossed, trying my absolute best to keep a neutral expression, but inside, I was doing a full-on celebratory jig, complete with imaginary confetti. The HOA board, of course, was a completely different story. The phone calls started almost immediately after the police lights vanished down the road. First, it was Brenda, the treasurer, practically hyperventilating about liability, optics, and breach of contract. Then came old Mr. Henderson, the board president, usually all pomp and circumstance, suddenly sounding like a terrified squirrel caught in a lawnmower. It was all apologies, of course. We had no idea, Mr. Smith, truly, we assumed the well was community property. An oversight, A terrible oversight. Assumed. My foot. They had the paperwork, plain as day, but they just never bothered to read it, or worse, they willfully dismissed it because it involved my land and my pesky farm. I had to sit down with them a few days later, in their stuffy little clubhouse that still smelled faintly of stale coffee and pure, unadulterated desperation. I came prepared, bringing my original deed, the water rights documentation, everything laid out neat and tidy, highlighted, even. They practically genuflected. The sheer embarrassment on their faces was priceless, a masterpiece of corporate shame. They kept trying to frame it as a misunderstanding, a clerical error. But let's be real, it was willful ignorance, powered by Karen's busybody meddling and their own lack of due diligence. I just let them squirm, occasionally interjecting with a calm. The documentation is quite clear, gentlemen. We're still hashing out some of the details, like who pays for the extra filtration system they now want to install on my main water line, just to be extra sure the community gets their pristine, fish-free water. Spoiler alert, it's definitely them. My lawyer sent them a very polite but firm letter. But the best part, truly, the sheer, unadulterated absurdity of it all. This woman, this absolute Karen, called the actual police on me for moving my fish in my pond, fed by my well, which happens to be the very same well that provides water to her house and every other house in the entire development. You just can't make this stuff up. It's the kind of story you tell at barbecues for years. Every now and then, I still see her. She still lives in the development, though I hear her husband's been doing most of the grocery runs and lawn care lately. She avoids eye contact like it's the plague, and if she catches a glimpse of my old pickup, she practically vaults over hedges or swerves into ditches to get away. Honestly, I don't hold a grudge. It's just comical. The whole thing was such an unnecessary spectacle, born purely out of entitlement and a complete lack of basic property research. It was a headache, for sure, a monumental waste of everyone's time and resources, but knowing that the very water she uses to wash her organic kale, fill her fancy coffee maker, and water her prize-winning petunias comes directly from my land, from a source I control, and that she had the unmitigated audacity to try and dictate what I do with it, that's a thought that brings a little weary, but deeply satisfied, smile to my face every single time. It's a good story for the grandkids, that's for sure. And the fish, they're thriving. Couldn't ask for more.